Welcome to the Spitzen-Körper Thelema. The passage we're examining tonight comes from Francis Yates' foundational study of Renaissance Hermeticism, Giordano Bruno, and the Hermetic tradition, published in 1964. Yates was reconstructing the intellectual genealogy of a problem that had haunted Christian Hermetists since the 4th century: how to reconcile the teachings of Hermes Trismegistus, the legendary Egyptian sage whose writings seemed to contain ancient wisdom and even Christian prophecy, with the explicit theological condemnation of those same teachings by Augustine of Hippo. This is not a peripheral concern. The recovery of Hermetic texts in 15th century Florence became the intellectual spark that ignited Renaissance magic, Neoplatonic philosophy, and ultimately the scientific revolution itself. Yates is tracking the exact mechanism by which Renaissance thinkers neutralized Augustine's authority, and in doing so, she illuminates what we might call the archetypal hermeneutical move, the reinterpretation of dangerous texts as corrupted or misunderstood. We are reading the history of how authority gets reinvented. The current of thought here belongs to the history of Renaissance intellectual culture in its moment of maximum creative tension, the period between roughly 1460 and 1600, when the recovery of Greek manuscripts from Byzantium created an intellectual free space. Yates positions this not as mere antiquarianism, but as the recovery of what was believed to be an unbroken chain of ancient wisdom stretching from Egypt through Plato to the Church Fathers themselves. The Hermetic writings were not exotic curiosities. They were the backbone of a competing cosmology. And Augustine had attacked them directly. The passage begins with Lactantius, the 4th century Christian apologist who read the Asclepius and the Commander and recognized in them references to the Son of God and the creative Logos. For Lactantius, Hermes Trismegistus was a Gentile prophet, a pagan voice testifying to Christian truth. He cites him alongside the Sibyls as one of those figures, outside the Abrahamic revelation, who somehow glimpsed the coming of Christ. Lactantius constructs a theology of pagan foreshadowing. Hermes becomes useful, recuperated, harmonized. But then Augustine arrives, and everything changes. Augustine, reading the same Asclepius in its Latin translation, fastens upon a passage that describes how Egyptian priests animated statues of gods by drawing demons or spirits into them, a practice of what we might call operative magic or god-making. Augustine reads this as idolatry and demon worship. Worse, he reads Hermes as praising this practice. The context of Augustine's attack is his broader critique of magic itself and his polemic against Apuleius of Madaura, that educated Platonist who sought salvation in Egyptian occultism and wrote the Golden Ass. For Augustine, what Lactantius read as prophecy is actually the work of a man in league with demons, deceived by the very spirits he worshipped. Hermes may speak truths about God, but these truths come through demonic mediation, and his foreknowledge of Christianity's triumph comes not from divine inspiration but from diabolic confederation. Augustine grants Hermes a kind of broken knowledge. He says much of God according to the truth, but that knowledge is contaminated at its source. Here is the text itself. The perfect word, or sermo perfectus, is a correct translation of the original Greek title of the Asclepius, and the passage which Lactantius quotes in Greek corresponds roughly to a passage in our Latin translation. Thus the Asclepius, the work which contains the weird description of how the Egyptians fabricated their idols and the lament for the Egyptian religion, becomes sanctified because it contains a prophecy concerning the Son of God. It was not only in the Asclepius that the Hermetic writers used the expression Son of God. At the beginning of Commander, which is the Hermetic account of creation, the act of creation is said to be through a luminous word, who is the Son of God. When discussing the Son of God as the creative word, with quotations from the scriptures, Lactantius brings in Gentile confirmation, pointing out that the Greeks speak of him as the Logos, and also Trismegistus. He was doubtless thinking of the passage on the creative word as the Son of God in the Commander, and he adds that Trismegistus, who by some means or other searched into almost all truth, often described the excellence and the majesty of the word. Indeed, Lactantius regards Hermes Trismegistus as one of the most important of the Gentile seers and prophets who foresaw the coming of Christianity, because he spoke of the Son of God and of the Word. Lactantius nowhere says anything against Hermes Trismegistus. He's always the most ancient and all-wise writer, the tenor of whose works is agreeable to Christianity and whose mention of God the Son places him with the Sibyls as a Gentile prophet. Augustine was, however, a difficulty for the Renaissance magus who wished to remain a Christian, for Augustine in the De Civitate Dei delivers a severe condemnation of what Hermes the Egyptian, called Trismegistus, wrote concerning idols, that is to say of the passage in the Asclepius, which he quotes at length, on how the Egyptians in their magical religion animated the statues of their gods by magic means, by drawing spirits into them. Augustine is using, not a Greek text of the Asclepius, as Lactantius had done, but the same Latin translation which we have, and which must therefore be at least as early as the 4th century. The context in which Augustine makes his attack on the idolatrous passage in the Asclepius is important. He's been attacking magic in general, and in particular the views on spirits or demons held by Apuleius of Madaura. Apuleius of Madaura is a striking example of one of those men, highly educated in the general culture of the Greco-Roman world who, weary of the stale teachings of the schools, sought for salvation in the occult, and particularly in the Egyptian type of the occult. Born circa AD 123, Apuleius was educated at Carthage and at Athens and later traveled to Egypt where he became involved in a lawsuit in which he was accused of magic. He is famous for his wonderful novel, popularly known as The Golden Ass, the hero of which is transformed by witches into an ass, and after many sufferings in his animal form, is transformed back into human shape after an ecstatic vision of the goddess Isis, which comes to him on a lonely seashore whither he has wandered in despair. Eventually he becomes a priest of Isis in an Egyptian temple. The whole mood of this novel, with its ethical theme, its ecstatic initiation or illumination, its Egyptian coloring, is like the mood of the Hermetic writings. Augustine calls Apuleius a Platonist, and he attacks him for the views on airy spirits or demons which he held to be intermediaries between gods and men. Augustine regards this as impious, not because he disbelieves in airy spirits or demons but because he thinks they are wicked spirits or devils. He then goes on to attack Hermes Trismegistus for praising the Egyptians for the magic by which they drew such spirits or demons into the statues of their gods, thus animating the statues, or making them into gods. Here he quotes verbally the god-making passage in the Asclepius. Hermes presages these things as the devil's confederate, suppressing the evidence of the Christian name, and yet foretelling with a sorrowful intimation, that from it should proceed the wreck of all their idolatrous superstitions, for Hermes was one of those who, knowing God, glorified him not as God, nor were thankful, but became vain in their imaginations, and their foolish heart was full of darkness. Yet, continues Augustine, this Hermes says much of God according to the truth, though in his admiration for the Egyptian idolatry he was blind, and his prophecy of its passing he had from the devil. Augustine says nothing whatever about Hermes' mention of the Son of God, and his whole treatment of the subject is perhaps, in part, a reply to Lactantius' glorification of Hermes as a Gentile prophet. But to the Renaissance magus, the magic in the Asclepius was the most attractive part of the Hermetic writings. How was a Christian magus to get round Augustine? Marsilio Ficino did it by quoting Augustine's Condemnation, and then ignoring it, though timidly, by practicing magic. Giordano Bruno was to take the bolder course of maintaining that the magical Egyptian religion of the world was not only the most ancient but also the only true religion, which both Judaism and Christianity had obscured and corrupted. There is another passage on Hermes Trismegistus in the De Civitate Dei, widely separated from the one on the Egyptian idolatry and in quite a different context. Augustine is affirming the extreme antiquity of the Hebrew tongue and that the Hebrew prophets and patriarchs are much earlier than any of the Gentile philosophers, and the wisdom of the patriarchs earlier than the Egyptian wisdom. Truly nothing but astronomy, and such other sciences as rather seem to exercise the wit than to elevate the knowledge. For as for morality, it stood not in Egypt until Trismegistus' time, who was indeed long before the sages and philosophers of Greece, but after Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, and Moses also, for at the time when Moses was born, was Atlas, Prometheus' brother, a great astronomer, living, and he was grandfather by the mother's side to the elder Mercury, who begot the father of this Trismegistus. Augustine thus confirmed with the great weight of his authority the extreme antiquity of Hermes Trismegistus, who was long before the sages and philosophers of Greece. And by giving him this curious genealogy, whereby he is dated 3 generations later than a contemporary of Moses. Augustine raised a question which was to be much debated concerning the relative dates of Moses and Hermes. All these views were to be held by later Hermetists and Magi. About 1460, a Greek manuscript was brought to Florence from Macedonia by a monk, one of those many agents employed by Cosimo de' Medici to collect manuscripts for him. It contained a copy of the Corpus Hermeticum. Though the Plato manuscripts were already assembled, awaiting translation, Cosimo ordered Ficino to put these aside and to translate the work of Hermes Trismegistus at once, before embarking on the Greek philosophers. It is Ficino himself who tells us this. Cosimo had handed over to him the works of Plato for translation. But in the year 1463 word came to Ficino from Cosimo that he must translate Hermes first, at once, and go on afterwards to Plato. Ficino made the translation in a few months, whilst the old Cosimo, who died in 1464, was still alive. Then he began on Plato. It is an extraordinary situation. There are the complete works of Plato, waiting, and they must wait whilst Ficino quickly translates Hermes, probably because Cosimo wants to read him before he dies. What a testimony this is to the mysterious reputation of the thrice great one. Cosimo and Ficino knew from the fathers that Hermes Trismegistus was much earlier than Plato. They also knew the Latin Asclepius which whetted the appetite for more ancient Egyptian wisdom from the same pristine source. Egypt was before Greece, Hermes was earlier than Plato. What Yates is demonstrating here is the infrastructure of Renaissance intellectual authority. Lactantius and Augustine are not enemies, they are the same source tradition, read in opposite directions. Both are read selectively. The Renaissance magus cannot simply reject Augustine. Augustine's weight in Christendom is absolute. But Augustine has given them something to work with. He has dated Hermes near Moses, he has confirmed his antiquity, and he has grudgingly admitted that Hermes says much of God according to the truth. One solution, the one Ficino followed, is tactical reading, quote Augustine's Condemnation aloud, then quietly ignore it in practice. Another solution, which Bruno would embrace more radically, is to invert Augustine's entire moral hierarchy. If the Egyptian religion is indeed ancient, if its magic is real, then perhaps Augustine was wrong to condemn it. Perhaps the chain of tradition runs deeper than Christianity's claims of supersession. What Yates captures is the moment when a text's authority becomes separable from its content. Augustine condemns Hermetic magic, yet Augustine's own authority, his dating of Hermes, his confirmation of the text's antiquity, his admission that they contain truth, becomes the scaffolding upon which Renaissance magic rebuilt itself. The Asclepius passage on animated statues and demon channeling, which Augustine reads as idolatry, becomes for Ficino and Bruno a description of genuine operative knowledge. The contaminated knowledge becomes the only knowledge worth having. This is not naive misreading. This is the deliberate reconstruction of a rival tradition within the shell of Christian discourse. And it works. By 1500, Hermes Trismegistus is no longer a condemned pagan prophet. He is the founder of an ancient Egyptian theology that subsists beneath and before Christianity itself. Next, Marsilio Ficino, Introduction to the Commander. The Spitzen-Körper Thelema. If this archive serves you, support it on Patreon. Link in the description.